Hi, I'm Ed Bacon, the rector of All Saints Church, Pasadena. Whoever you are and wherever you find yourself on the journey of faith, I hope that you'll find something here that speaks to you. Welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here on this rainy day. We're in for a treat to be with one another and our speaker. It's so most of you who know me know how important depression is. In that depression is what was the grace that led me to 8 years of psychotherapy with a psychiatrist. You think I'm crazy now. I mean, you should have seen me before I had to go into all of that. And it's a wonderful thing. And here we have someone, a brilliant educator, thinker, writer, talking today about faith and depression. Our speaker is a scholar and activist committed to connecting faith and social justice, an ordained elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Monica A. Coleman has earned degrees at Harvard, Vanderbilt, and Claremont Graduate University. She's currently the Associate Professor of Constructive Theology and African American Religions and co-director of the Center for Process Studies at Claremont School of Theology. She is a friend of this institution and of the values that pulse in this place. She has a book called Not Alone, and it's a wonderful time for you to make purchases getting ready for the holidays. Without further ado, will you warmly help me welcome Monica A. Coleman. Welcome.
Good morning. It's a real joy to be here. I was saying I used to live around the corner from here on Colorado and El Molino when I lived in Pasadena. So I would always kind of walk over. I felt like I was creeping over to the early service on Ash Wednesday. And so it's really good to be here. And as I was telling Reverend Bacon, All Saints is famous among progressive Christians around the world. I don't know if because there aren't that many of us or because really you're such a beacon on a hill for those of us who are looking for community with progressive Christian values. Now, I'm a philosophical theologian, which means that I use philosophical ideas and ideas about our worldview to talk about how we think about God. And generally that means that text and narrative are nice but not necessary for me. But I'm in a church, I'm a minister, and so I've noticed that, especially in black church traditions, using the Bible is really helpful. So I thought I'd try that today as well. And I'm going to start off with a passage that has always captivated me when it comes to the topic of mental health and religion, particularly mental health and Jesus, and then talk a little bit about that. Cool?
Cool.
See, just like my classes, I say cool, y'all say yeah. Right, this is from the 5th chapter of the Gospel according to Mark, verses 1 through 20. They came to the other side of the sea, to the country of the Gerasenes. And they is Jesus and the disciples. And when Jesus had stepped out of the boat, immediately a man out of the tombs with an unclean spirit met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could restrain him any more, even with a chain, for he had often been restrained with shackles and chains. But the chains he wrenched apart, and the shackles he broke in pieces, and no one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and the mountains, he was always howling and bruising himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him, and he shouted at the top of his voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he said to him, and this being Jesus said to the man, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." Then Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He said, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now there on the hillside a great herd of swine was feeding, and the unclean spirits begged him, "Send us into the swine, let us enter them." So he, being Jesus, gave them permission. And the unclean spirits came out and entered the swine and the herds, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea, and were drowned in the sea. The swineherders ran off and told it in the city and in the country. Then people came to see what it was that had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demoniac, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind. the very man who had had the legion, and they were afraid. Then they began to, those who had seen what happened to the demoniac and to the swine reported it. Then they began to beg Jesus to leave their neighborhood. As Jesus was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed by demons begged Jesus that he might be with him. But Jesus refused and said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and what mercy God has shown you." And he went away and began to proclaim in Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him. And everyone was amazed. Words of God for people of God. See, it's a test of how church you are. No, I'm joking. Just joking. Anyone here ever been to camp or places where there are a whole bunch of kids getting together? Ever? Yeah, right. And you ever play that game where you sit in a circle and one person decides they have like a secret and they tell it to the person's ear next to them, and then that person whispers into the ear of the person next to them all the way around, and when it comes back around, it doesn't sound like what the first person said? Y'all remember that game? Right? I don't know what the game is called, but I think a lot of us have played this game. Right? What's it called? All right, telephone. Wow. Clearly was not made for the land of cell phones, right? Right, so we play the telephone game, right? And part of the lesson you're supposed to learn is that when you tell somebody something and they keep passing it on, it doesn't come out the way it first started. And the moral of the story is don't gossip, right? Don't spread rumors. Well, I think that's an important lesson to learn. Right? Of course, the more you tell a story, the less it sounds like it did the first time, particularly since we're not the kind of people who live in highly oral cultures where we would memorize these long stories and pass them on to generations and generations. That's like centuries ago. So that's really true for us. I think there's another lesson that comes from that story, from the game. And that game is it's kind of the opposite. Not only is it that the more you say something and pass it on and retell a story, the less it sounds like it used to sound. But also, if you want the story to sound the way you want it to sound, you should tell it yourself. So remember that, 'cause I'm going to come back to it. Cool? Cool. Great. So this story that I read in Mark really captures my attention. I mean, it's the kind of thing you can't even really imagine or don't want to imagine happening in our time, right? So there's a demoniac. Who would call someone else a demoniac, first of all, right? Like a person who's just possessed by demons. Because a lot of us, when we think of demons, we have that whole kind of exorcism thing, right? The heads spin around, or those really dark, kind of creepy TV shows. I find them creepy, at least, right? You know, where everyone's wearing like black or red, and there's somebody sucking blood or tormenting, or they're unfriendly ghosts, just kind of creepy stuff, like the kind of thing you really want to exorcise, right? But we don't really think of that as happening in our everyday lives for the most part. So I'm always struck by this story of a demoniac. So there's not only a demoniac, this guy who's possessed by a demon, he's not just haunting a house, he's like out here, right? And everybody knows he's like the town demoniac, right? People know about him. He hangs out in the cemeteries. Life is not very good for him, as we can tell. He seems to be isolated, but it's not like nobody knows who he is, right? So he's our local town demoniac, our local town crazy person. Now that we do understand, right? Especially if you live in a city, there's always somebody who's homeless, who appears homeless at least, who doesn't seem to be quite right, is always asking kind of for odd requests from people they don't know. Sometimes it's for money, but usually it's for something that just seems like it doesn't quite fit the time and place of what we're going at, right? So we kind of have a town crazy person. Okay, we understand the crazy town person who everyone knows. But this is not just a crazy town person, right, the town crazy person, but you have this conversation with Jesus and the town crazy person that actually seems to make sense, right? So maybe crazy most of the time, but not all the time. And says, okay, I recognize, Jesus, that you're somebody special. You're not just some guy walking around, but you have a very special relationship with God, and I recognize this, and he calls him Son of God, Most High. And he says, well, what's your name? He says, my name is Legion. And we've heard this part before. Now, there are a couple things that I always find really interesting about this passage. One that always kind of bothers me is, like, what did the pigs do? Like, so Jesus is going to cast these demons out into well, don't send me over there, send me to the pigs. Okay, you can send them to the pigs. And then, in some of the passages, the pigs run down the hill and they go into the water and they drown. And I'm like, what about the guy whose livelihood it was to take care of the pigs? Like, this is just a little bit bothersome as a text to me. And so I'm like, the pigs are gone. They're now possessed. Can you really do this? Can you really just like cast something out of one person and into pigs? Like, I mean, just think about that for a second. It almost kind of defies our normal logic. Because at least like in Ghostbusters, y'all remember Ghostbusters, right? They went into the machine, right? I mean, you didn't just put them into swine. You sucked them into the machine and then cast them out into the bad, dark place where they're supposed to be, right? You didn't just put them into some helpless pig. So that really bothers me. So the other part that really bothers me is how I've heard this passage preached, all right? And the part that bothers me about it is everyone says the big deal is that even crazy people know who Jesus is. Right? This is supposed to be the take-home lesson. Right? Even the possessed people who have many, many demons within them know Jesus when they see Jesus. Well, good for them. Right? Because I'm like, I don't think this is the take-home lesson, that it's okay to shove demons into swine and even crazy people. Are you okay? Oh, good. Even crazy people know who Jesus is. And this is what we should take home from this passage. So I would like to suggest another way of looking at the passage and talk about the part that speaks to me when I read it. And he's the town crazy guy. And his life is really bad. He's always hanging out in cemeteries because all he thinks about is death. All he can get around is death. Maybe it's his own death. Maybe he's been hurt and saddened by the death of somebody who's close to him. And he's in a lot of pain. But sometimes when you're in a pain that you feel inside, you wish so deeply that you could show other people the pain because they can't see it, because you look like you're okay. And so one thing he does to make this intangible pain real is he cuts himself. And so he uses stones and he begins to cut himself, because then you could actually see that he's hurting, because most of his hurt's on the inside. And other people don't think this is a good idea. They think it's unhealthy. And so they try to keep him from cutting himself because they don't want him to hurt himself. So they try to bind him. But he wants so badly for people to see his pain that he always gets out of them and is able to cut himself again. And no one knows what to do with that. So they just say, well, go over there. Hang out among those who are like you, those who seem to be the living dead. And so I think that a lot of people have this idea of the town crazy person, and it's easy, almost too easy, for me even, say, well, there's the people over here who we see who seem to be homeless and who seem not to have enough and who always ask for weird stuff at weird times. I'm just trying to go to Starbucks and get my coffee, right? And then there's my friend, not me, but my friend, who got really sad when someone who she loved died and didn't leave the house for a month. And we draw these distinctions between the crazy town person and the friend we know who got really sad when something happened, as if they're two different things. I'd like to suggest that they're not. That we're all on a spectrum of mental health. And that every one of us, whether we live with a clinical condition like this man who we might talk about as having a dissociative disorder, or what we used to call multiple personality disorder, right? My name is Legion, for we are many. Or those of us who've experienced an inevitable life crisis and have had the kind of post-traumatic or depressive symptoms that come at the end of that. That we're all the same people who Jesus is interacting with. And that we shouldn't make these broad distinctions between the crazy town person over here, who's not like us, and then us, who gets sad when someone we love dies, because that's what happens when someone you love passes away, as an example, and the full range in between. And the other thing that I really like about this passage is Jesus casts them out. Well, okay, Jesus casts what out? Because wouldn't it be really great if we could cast out depression? Yes, right? I mean, if I had a wand, right? I mean, maybe I don't have this kind of faith, which I'm willing to acknowledge, where somebody says, cast it out in the name of Jesus, right? And then it goes out, right? Like, that would be super cool. And it could be that it's possible and my faith isn't strong enough. But I'd like to suggest that it's probably just more nuanced than that. That the casting out isn't this like magical potion, right? Where if it were a cartoon, you'd have a wand and it goes shoo, right? And you see the little yellow. You all know how the cartoons go, right? You see the yellow thing and it comes popping out and goes into can't you see the animated version of the scene? And it goes into the pigs, right? I mean, wouldn't it be wonderful if it happened that way? But that really isn't how it works. Nothing snaps us out of it. Kind of dealing and living with depression and any mental health challenge is an everyday thing. It's a journey. It can get way better, but instantly, like pow, I haven't experienced that. And I don't really actually know anyone else who has. But what I like about it, though, is that he actually does cast this thing out. Well, what does it mean to cast out a demon that we would now identify as a mental health challenge? How do you cast that out? Well, one of the things I think that we can learn from this passage is what the man says. He says, "My name is Legion, for we are many." Well, that's not that exciting, really. But what I think is that he actually says, this is my name, and this is what I experience. Right? So if it were me, I would say, my name is Monica, and I live with a bipolar depressive condition. That, I'd like to suggest, is the casting out. That the casting out isn't that big wand thing that Jesus takes and shoops at them and they jump into the swine, right? And that casting out doesn't come by this tremendous, amazing amount of faith where someone puts their hand on your head and they say, I cast it out in the name of Jesus, and then it happens. Although God bless anyone who gets to have that kind of experience, because I think that would be amazing. And I think that it's not always that what we're experiencing is demonic. It's not necessarily this bad thing. Sometimes what we experience, well, this is a natural response to what happens when you have a heart and when you live and when you go through life and when you've experienced different things. And sometimes your body's chemistry is just not working with you. It's just what it is. It's not demonic. It's not necessarily something that needs to go cast out into some poor little pigs somewhere, right? It's just part of the texture of one's life. And it can be a very crippling and hurtful and destructive part of one's life, like we see with the man here. Or it can just be a very difficult part of one's life, as we see for some other people. And I'd like to say that what it means to cast out is to just be able to say, my name is Monica, I live with a bipolar depressive condition. My name is Legion, for we are many. That what really casts out, and by casting out I mean disarms the power, right? So it's not something that's transferable, right? Like to pigs. But to cast out is just to disarm the power, to take away the part that constrains you, that isolates you, that makes you live among the tombs. That's all it means to cast out. And one way we cast out, a big way we cast out that this passage suggests, is just by telling our story. You don't have to give the long version of the story. You can just give the short version of the story. Say, this is who I am. This is what I live with. This is who I am. This is what I experience. Because what happens is kind of what we see happens here in the passage. When we're able to just be honest about what we experience, that it doesn't mean we've lost faith. It doesn't mean we hate God, although sometimes it does. It doesn't mean we can't recognize Jesus, although sometimes we can't. Just saying, this is who I am and this is my experience, is it takes away the power. It takes away the isolation. And so we see that just saying that helped the man to feel sane. So in some way, I have to put it more colloquially, admitting you're crazy makes you sane, right? Admitting that you're not perfect, admitting that you struggle, admitting that something is really hard and difficult, admitting that you don't know what to do. This is part of our testimony. It's part of our encounter with that which is holy. It's part of how we meet Jesus and how Jesus meets us. And for me, that's a big testimony, right? You go from having the town crazy person walking around the tombs who no one wants to be around because, well, they're over there. They probably haven't taken a shower in a couple days, and they're just kind of offensive, and I don't really know what to say when they ask me for all those inappropriate things when I'm getting my Starbucks coffee, right? To this person saying, hey, I had this encounter with this man, and it changed me. Now, I'd like to think part of what the big change was that Jesus saw him and just asked him who he was. And so what I get from this is that we actually can play two kinds of roles. We can be like this man and be willing to say, this is my experience, right? This is who I am. This is my experience. And we can also be like Jesus and say, who are you? What's your name? And that's a really powerful thing, I think, particularly for those of us who call ourselves faithful. Because, we have this thing, it's something I love about California, right? Let's do lunch, right? I mean, I just want to have my people call your people. I don't even have people to call your people, but how cool would that be, right? We have these things where we network, and there are books about how to network. And I'm like, what is that? What about just talking to people and making friends, right? But it speaks to our kind of world's tendency to just be brief and be clipped and say, how are you doing? And keep going and not waiting for the answer. Hey, what's up? Or what's your name? But really stopping and saying, he sees him. Jesus sees not that he's the crazy town person. He sees the guy who's in pain. And he says, what's your name? And he's asking not just, my name is Monica. He's asking for his story. Tell me something about yourself. And I'm going to stand here and I'm going to listen. And that's what casts out demons. That's what casts out the things that we're afraid of. That's what casts out the things that hurt us so much, is just stopping, asking, and then being willing to say, this is my story, and that's okay. And I think when we're able to do that, that is an encounter with the holy. We're channeling the holy, we're meeting the holy in other people, and it's something to be amazed about. And so I wanted to take the last couple minutes before we have time for question and answer, and I wanted to read one part of this book. My book is called Not Alone, Reflections on Faith and Depression. It's a 40-day devotional, and I want to read the first part because I think it kind of connects in with this passage a little bit, and also with some of the commitments I know this community has. And it's on the first day, so I'm giving away the first day. That's cool. And it's called The Closet of My Own. I was still in high school when Essence magazine published an article by its then editor, Linda Villarosa, and her mother, Clara Villarosa. Coming Out was the name of the article. It told the story of Linda's revelation and acceptance of her lesbian identity, from her perspective and from her mother's perspective. This story stayed with me because it was the first time I heard about the closet. Although new to me at the time, the closet is a common metaphor for describing the ways that lesbians and gays hide or deny their sexualities from the wider world around them. In the article, Linda Villarosa writes, quote, I tried to straddle both worlds, happy with my lover, pretending to be accepting of my new life, but secretly scared and insecure. I was passing, but always petrified that someone would uncover my secret, end quote. As a teenager, I could not have explained why I found this article so compelling or why I related so closely to Linda's description of the closet. But I was living in a closet of my own. I knew how it felt to be happy and free in some contexts, and terrified and alone in others. I now realize that I have known this feeling for most of my life. I have lived with long and terrible depression since I was a teenager, and this was my secret. I was convinced that even if I looked happy and successful on the outside, that if people dug just a little deeper, they would find a river of sadness flowing just below the surface of my skin. I worked hard to keep people from touching me below my joyful epidermis. At times, this took all the energy I could muster. Other times, it was easier because I actually felt happy. I received such affirmation from my professional successes and my effervescent personality that I came to believe that this was the only part of me that people loved. The only part of me that people loved. If people knew who I really was, how sad I really was, they would not love me. I wanted to be loved, so I had to hide inside a closet of my own. For years, I lacked a language for my condition. The constant moving associated with my education and employment meant that I was rarely in the same place for long. I had new doctors, new friends, and new community every couple of years. Few people knew me long enough to see the deep sorrow and the long bursts of energy and productivity that produced my resume. Few people knew me well enough to see this. I had not let them. And like a river shored up by a shoddily made dam, my condition leaked through the gaping holes in my life. Those with eyes to see, usually lovers and friends who were therapists, began to ask me about my depression. What depression? I replied. I never admitted my deep, constant levels of pain until I was raped. Therapy and research taught me that I was responding to the trauma of rape. I owned the suffering and the healing process. I became an activist against sexual violence, hiding the fact that I had nightmares and tears long before I was raped, and long after. 2 significant suicidal episodes, medication, and hospitalization did not remove the shame I felt about living with what my doctors would later name a bipolar II condition. And yet, as Audre Lorde wrote so poignantly, my silences had not protected me. Depression is a part of my life, whether I tell anyone or not, whether I hide it or not. I'm terrified. I'm afraid of being called crazy. I'm an academic. I make my living off my mind. My mind can play deathly tricks on me. I'm a minister. I tell people that God loves them and wants the best for them. The truth is that depression can make you question everything, especially whether God loves you. I'm a sister, daughter, cousin, niece, lover, colleague, friend, and mother. Will these people still love me when they learn that I've been lying to them about who I am and how I feel? The fact that I've spoken out against sexual violence for almost 15 years does not make this any easier. Rape was a discrete event that someone else did to me. Living with levels of debilitating sadness comes from inside of me. I can't name a beginning or an end. It is with me, and I am mortally afraid of talking about this. Yet I will. Because I know what it's like to search for metaphors and stories and narratives to give voice to what seems so wordless inside. I've read newsletters, blogs, memoirs, and textbooks looking for someone to describe how this feels and for what it's like to be faithful in the midst of these things. I met Linda Villarosa in 2006 when I invited her to speak at a conference on Black women, mental health, and faith at Bennett College for Women. I told her that I remembered her 1991 article. I told her how it spoke to me. I told her about my closet. And during that conference, I came out. Huddling away from the spring rains in the historic chapel, the audience heard me say that I live with a depressive condition. The ground did not open and swallow me up. There were no loud gasps from the audience. No one threw tomatoes at me. I did not die. I am not alone. I have a quiet community of friends who live with different types of clinical depressions, dispersed around the country and at first unknown to one another. We discovered our bond only when one of us let it slip in an intimate conversation. Now we know from the first hello if something is wrong. We sit and lose time together. We check in on one another. We talk about medication, exercise, and sunshine. We know when to become officially worried. So I'm ranting and writing for us and for the people who know us and love us. Because, as Linda wrote in her article, quote, the closet is dark and lonely and not someplace I plan to hide away. So I have 2 questions at the end of every entry. And one's an exploration question, which asks you to kind of reflect backwards. And one's a reflection question, which asks you to look forward in a way. So the 2 questions I have at the end of this passage are this. How do you hide? And then what scares you the most about sharing? What scares you the most about sharing? Thank you. Thank you.
Great job.
I think they're ready for next service, right?
Pardon?
Looking ready for next service.
Yeah. We have questions. And here's the microphones. Please raise your hand. And here come the microphones to you. There are 2 hands up right here. Joe, right there, and then Hilda. Joe?
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
I too am an academic and a lifelong depressive, and presently a therapist working with only chronically psychotic patients in care facilities. There's a major schism in psychiatry right now, I'm sure you're aware of, and one group is saying that psychosis is a brain disease, take a pill. Psychiatrists are no longer being trained in psychotherapy. And then there are another group of therapists who are moving away from the scientific orientation toward a spiritual orientation. This was best epitomized by Deepak Chopra, who 2 years ago addressed the major therapeutic conference of therapists by saying that it was time for psychotherapists to leave their identification with medicine and return to their original identification with the church, with spiritual healing. I was just interested in your reactions to that.
Man, the medication one. Well, one, thank you so much for sharing and sharing your story and casting out in that way. I actually do have a passage, entry in here about medication, because it's hard to talk about mental health and not talk about medication. I would say one is, oh, that I wish psychiatrists were trained to be therapists too. Not only would it be much easier and simpler, perhaps, insurance-wise, and keep you from talking to two different people who don't know what you're saying to them and retelling your story, which is never fun. But I do wish they were closer aligned, number one. And I think one reason is that, I'll say about medication two things. One is that I think you need to have faith in it to work, for it to work, right? And some people actually have a lot of faith in medication, and some people are fairly skeptical of medication, and there's people kind of in the middle, right? But I do think that, and I can't say it won't work if you don't have faith in it, but I can say that you kind of have to believe it's going to help you. At least that's what I think. And there's nothing scientific about it. It's just what I think, right? And the experience I've had, that I was very, very anti-medication. And at some point I had to say, well, maybe, just maybe, God can work through medication. You know, that if I'm serious about my incarnational theology, and I really believe that God is with us, and the Word becomes flesh, and that God is in everything, every atom, every cell, then surely God is in medication. And I have to have some faith that this is going to help me. On the other hand, I think what's helpful is knowing that there are limitations to medication. That medication is very good and very helpful in helping symptoms. And symptoms are important because symptoms can take you out, right? If you are suicidal, if you are hurting, you have a threat to hurt people, you actually just alleviating symptoms is a really, really big deal, right? And so people say, oh, it just alleviates symptoms. Like symptoms are this little small thing, right? Like if you can't sleep, getting sleep is really exciting. And if it can help you get some sleep, right? I'm a mother of a newborn, so sleep is on my mind all the time. If you can help you get some sleep and then you can think clearly, then you want that. But it doesn't do the same thing that spiritual care does. It doesn't do what psychotherapeutic care can do. And so I'd like to think that they should be more closely aligned, right? And sometimes spiritual care can't just get you to sleep. Right? I mean, for me, if I meditate, I go to sleep because I'm not that good at meditation. But not because meditation actually makes you sleep. Right? So I'd like to think that they should be closer aligned and that we can see that they work together and that God is in both of them.
Yes.
Great.
Thank you so much for sharing your wonderful and personal, heartfelt ideas and insights with us. I'm Gil, and I'm a therapist. This is a 12-step meeting for therapists. I want to say we do have a lay counseling ministry here at the church, and anyone from the church community is invited to stop by the table and pick up a card and receive 10 free counseling sessions. We don't prescribe drugs. I come from a background, family and friends, with paranoid schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and a lot of mental health issues. And I certainly understand about the pain and the suffering caused by keeping those in a closet and living in there with those in the closet alone. A couple of ideas I'd like to float up and hear your response to. One is the idea of imprisoning beliefs that many of us carry around. Those are the prisons within us that we create and build ourselves. And these have been identified in psychological research as being some of the most pernicious demons. Secondly, Dr. Martin Seligman, who was president of the American Psychological Association, has stated many times he firmly believes that 80%, more or less, of people who are diagnosed with clinical depression really are just suffering from problems of living and shouldn't be medicated, but should be in intensive counseling and life coaching. So I'd like to hear your response to those ideas. Thank you.
Let's see, I'll do my best here. The imprisoning beliefs part. I'm a theologian, so yes. But I'd like to suggest that a lot of our beliefs, we didn't just kind of come up with ourselves, right? That we were given our beliefs by our environment, our parents, our churches. I mean, oh my gosh, I could do a whole thing on like this crap that a lot of churches tell us that make us feel sicker than we would normally be, right? Okay, right? I mean, so, an unhelpful theology can just take you under. For all types of reasons. And so I agree that imprisoning beliefs can in colloquial make you crazy, but also can really cause some severe mental health challenges. If you're believing, for example, that who you are is unloved by God and God's a really important being you're supposed to please, like as one small example, right? So that can just do a lot to you internally. And so I agree that imprisoning beliefs can be a really central part of what we experience with mental health challenges. About diagnosis, well, I actually think that, everybody over 10 could probably use a therapist. Because you've just experienced something in life, right? Whether it was on the playground or something far more traumatic that could use a good, impartial, I only care about you person to talk to, right? And it turns out you usually have to pay somebody to get something like that or something analogous, right? Because people we have relationships with always have a stake in what we say and who we are. And that's not a bad thing, right? Because they're going to filter it through their experience with us, their relationship with us. And so if you want somebody who only cares about what's best for you, you probably got to pay them. That's just my experience. And we could all use that, right? And most of us don't get that for all types of really good financial health insurance messy reasons. Get to have the opportunity to sit down and just say, can you help me process this? Or I experience this and it makes me feel this way, right? Unfortunately, mental health care is a privilege in this country and even more so in other countries when it shouldn't be. So I can see how somebody could get to a clinical place because they didn't have that at age 10, 11, and 12, forget 22 and 40, right? To have that kind of therapy. So from what I understand, clinical depression comes from a marker of symptoms, and they look in the book, and if you hit enough of them, then you have it, right? I don't do that, so I can't speak enough to it. But I do think that most of us really could use therapy, whether it's for a month, 10 years, depending on what you're bringing to it. Maybe a check-in once a year for a month would be really nice, right? Say, let me just tell you about my last year and see if any major stuff happened, right? Because it's true, kind of like the M. Scott Peck thing, right? Life is difficult. And it sounds small, but life can be really, really difficult, right? And so it can be very helpful to have someone to talk to. So in many ways, I agree with you there.
Is this on? Okay. I just wanted to say, to start right out with, I am a big believer in medicine. Mm-hmm. I think there is a lot of demonization of medicine. Oh, no, you can work it out all kinds of ways. I am not a therapist. I am a patient. And I spent about 30 years in different types of therapy. I would say that I gained some insights that didn't do a thing for my depression. They were interesting, but they did not help me to function better as a human being until I was prescribed a particular medicine that works very well. And from that point, I was able to take other steps which gradually pulled me more and more out of the depression. So, thank you.
All Saints Church.
Exactly. Exactly. You are so right about that, Ed, because All Saints Church has also given me other opportunities like volunteering.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you.
Yes.
Wow, I have a lot of things I could say to this. I am one of the 20% that do need medication. I am also a mental health professional. I'm a clinical psychologist, so I know the book really well where you check stuff off, and there are lots of things you can check from. There's also a category called NOS, which is not otherwise specified, which means if you don't make any of those boxes but you still hurt, you get a diagnosis. I also work in the public mental health system in forensic psychology, which is where most of our severely mentally ill people are now, because we decided to stop treating them in public hospitals and facilities. So we decided to send them to jail and prison instead, where they actually get less mental health care than they would. And then they come back to us, so we're working with that now. I have to say, as a psychologist and as a consumer, which is, we don't say patient anymore, we say consumers, it's really difficult sometimes to recognize that we are at times slaves to biology. If your neurochemistry is not functioning well, no amount of therapy is going to get that fixed. There is some research, however, that does say that some cognitive behavioral psychotherapy does change how the neural pathways work in your brain. But most of the time, you need a jump start before that's going to start working. I don't like it that I've been on antidepressants since, off and on for most of my life, but definitely since my son was born. And that I've had to tweak it a little bit, and that there are life issues that will impact it. Trauma is a tremendous one. Grief is a tremendous one. Just everyday stressors, financial stress is a huge one, and a lot of people have been suffering with that in the last few years. I really look at it like, if you were diabetic and they said you have to take insulin for the rest of your life or you're going to die, you would take insulin. If you had heart problems and high blood pressure and were at risk of stroke and they said you have to take hypertensive medicine or you're going to have a stroke, you would take the hypertensive medicine. For people who actually have really severe diagnosable biochemistry and neurochemistry anomalies, not abnormalities, anomalies, medication is a lifesaver. And also, as a therapist, I'm okay that psychiatrists don't do therapy because they usually get about a month's worth of training.
Well, I meant if they were good at it, but yeah.
Yeah. So I'm glad that they get years of training in medication, and I will go to them for that. But there is a place for psychotherapy, and there is a place for spiritual care, and there is a place simply for community and caring and sharing for everybody. And it would be really good if people who have mental health issues were able to talk about it with everyone, not just with professionals.
I do. Thank you for sharing, and I do shameless self-promotion here. Page 156, day 34, I talk about this a little bit on a passage called Sacrament. But, did I just lose the thought? Oh, I think I did. Oh, no, I hate it when that happens. It'll come back to me. I remember it now. See, just like that. The example you gave, I really appreciate, and that is that so often in our society there's a stigma with mental health challenges, but not with having diabetes or high blood pressure, right? So, I mean, part of the goal, and part of what it means to cast out the demons is the demon of stigma, the demon of shame, right? That I'm somehow worse off as a person, I have less content of character if I say I have a mental health challenge than if I tell you I have high blood pressure, right? So I appreciate you bringing that up, because I think that's also a big part of what it means to just keep talking about mental health, is to just take away that power, disarm the power that makes it secretive and bad and shameful and, by the way, right, kind of a thing.
Last question.
Hi, I have absolutely no qualifications to speak at all, so to my mouth. I have no qualifications to hold a microphone either. One thing you said that really struck me as healthy was that you spoke of the rape event. Mm-hmm. Not as a cause of anhedonia or anhedonia or whatever they call it, but as a trigger for something that was already in you. And distinguishing between, you used the word discrete. It was a discrete thing in your life, separated from everything else, and the realization that it was discrete took away its power. Can you speak further to that? Thank you.
In 1 minute. Yeah, I mean, for me, I was really able to distinguish, whether it was healthy or not, I'm not sure, between what it meant to be an activist around sexual violence, because first of all, I was an adult who was sexually violated, so my sexuality and my sense of self were formed when I was violated, which I think it makes a difference. And I could say, yes, this was this event that happened, and I became fairly clear relatively early on that someone violated me and did something to me that I didn't deserve, even though I had to live with the consequences of those, particularly the emotional consequences of those. Depression I couldn't name in the same way, right? I couldn't say this thing happened to me, that someone did to me, right? I couldn't figure out when it started. I couldn't figure out where it came from. I couldn't name it. Most people can't because it's so complex. And it's the brain. I mean, good night. No one really understands the brain, right? Like, you break your arm, it can get you a new arm. You break your brain, which is why you should wear a helmet when you bike. That's a public service announcement here, right? So, I mean, for me, it was so much more diffuse, and that made it harder to talk about. It made it harder because rape is over. I can talk about it. This isn't over. Right? I still live with depressive condition. I still wrestle with it some days more than others. It still kicks my ass, There's still days where nothing gets done. I mean, weeks. Right? So it's harder to talk about for me. And that made it so much more important for why I had to talk about it.
Before we thank Monica, let me just say that we'll continue next week from Claremont again, professor of neuroscience, Paul Zak. We continue focusing on the mind-body-brain connection. He'll be here to talk about oxytocin and the importance of hugging one another, etc. It is a feel-good time. So we are continuing along a theme that the Holy Spirit has given us, I think. But right now, what I want us to do is thank Monica so much.
Thank you.
Really wonderful. Outstanding. Magnificent.